You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City.
And this is Prashant Paramaswaran from Washington, D.C.
Good to be back with you, Prashant. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing well. It's good to be back. We'll have a lot to talk about today, obviously. So some of our listeners, I think, liked our most recent episode where we decided to go on a functional trip to talk a little bit about trade issues in Asia. So I thought that this episode we could devote to the topic of U.S. alliances more broadly, sort of taking stock of various issues that are bedeviling American alliances right now in the Asia-Pacific region. So I think the most logical place to start would be with the cost-sharing talks that are now a very hot topic in the U.S.-South Korea alliance. Talk a little bit about what that might mean for the eventual cost-sharing talks that the United States and Japan are going to have to do by around March 2021 when the existing cost-sharing agreement expires there. And then we can talk a little bit about the other alliances, including Thailand and the Philippines and Southeast Asia, and a little bit about Australia, if time permits. But I think, Prashant, this the South Korean alliance is, I think, in a very interesting place right now. This has been an alliance that's gone through its ups and downs over the past couple years in a remarkable way. The Special Measures Agreement, which is the 5-year cost-sharing plan between the two countries, expired last year and was extended by 1 year because the two sides couldn't actually come to an agreement on or at least the United States was demanding more than South Korea was willing to pay. And now, with talks progressing towards an eventual 5-year extension, the United States is effectively asking for a 5-fold increase in what South Korea contributes under the Special Measures Agreement, moving up to around $5 billion. And this is sort of something that I think Seoul had seen coming for a long time. It's obviously no secret that President Donald Trump has made alliances or views alliances in a very different way from all of his predecessors, viewing them essentially as transactional protection rackets where allies pay the United States for protection. And these issues aren't just happening in Asia. In Europe, there are similar concerns about the reliability of the United States. But today in Northeast Asia especially, the cornerstone of both South Korea and Japan's national defense strategies is their respective alliances with the United States. So given that alliances are strongest when they're built on a foundation of mutual political interest and mutual understanding, things don't look too good because both of these countries have their own concerns about the security environment in Asia, not just China, but for South Korea, especially the threat from North Korea, which is something that Japan also looks at. But yeah, I mean, when you look at these two alliances, Prashant, what's your sense of where things stand right now?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to argue against the fact that they're in a pretty dire situation. So, I mean, these are alliances that are decades old, and so you will always have, irrespective of what the president himself is doing, President Trump, and the trends that we see regionally and globally, there will always be the bureaucratic work of alignment management that's going on. You'll have talks, you'll have areas of cooperation, but I think definitely when you look at these big issues, burden sharing is one, which you mentioned that President Trump cares personally about. And that's where you're seeing some of the cost sharing mechanisms, having some of these delays and some of these fissures. Those negotiations, it's important to stress. I mean, it is true that, they are negotiated from time to time, and there are differences that need to be negotiated between the United States and these allies. But the degree of divergence that we're seeing under the Trump administration is quite unprecedented on these levels. So, that's one issue. But also, it's important, as you pointed out, the reason why these alliances are created in the first place is to actually sort of forge a common partnership against perceived threats and challenges. And this is an environment where, the Japan and South Korea both sense a threat from North Korea, given what they're undergoing. But there's also an ongoing conversation in all these alliances about, if the United States is waging strategic competition with China, what does that mean for its alliances? If the United States views China increasingly as a challenge or a threat, to what extent are these allies and other partners willing to go along with the United States? And I think on both those questions, the jury's still out, but there are a lot of these differences that matter not only for just, the negotiations themselves, but these big issues that we're talking about. It's also important to mention, I mean, these are alliances, so we are mostly concerned with the security aspect of this. But the other aspect of this that is also has also been, putting these alliances under stress is another thing that President Trump cares about is free trade and economic issues, right? The notion that the United States is being taken advantage of. And we've seen, multiple instances where both Japan and South Korea in particular have had to contend with this, right? So President Trump, tried to, and we know this publicly, withdraw from the U.S. South Korea free trade agreement, and that hasn't happened, fortunately. But nonetheless, you could perceive what the South Koreans might think when this occurred. Similarly, when the United States withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it was Japan that was actually keeping the ball rolling with CPTPP. So I think that's another point of stress for these alliances, and I sense it's not going to change as long as President Trump's in office.
Yeah, and the question now is how long will he be in office? Because at least with Japan and South Korea, the implications of a second term of the Trump presidency is, I think, something particularly dire. And of course, it's not just these allies. The Europeans are also thinking about the long-term health of NATO if Trump were to be reelected, given his sort of dubious commitment to the transatlantic alliance there, too. But with Japan, for example, the cost-sharing talks look very different if Trump is reelected versus if he isn't. Because March 2021, if Trump isn't reelected, that will be one of the first agenda items in the U.S.-Japan alliance for a next president of the United States, no matter what. So there, I think certain concerns are quite acute in Tokyo. And, we can recall Trump's visit to Japan earlier this year in the summer for the G20 with, the comments where he was standing right beside Abe and saying that, the U.S.-Japan alliance was unfair because of certain obligations. And we also had public reporting from Bloomberg that Trump had been telling his advisors that he'd been thinking about withdrawing from the U.S.-Japan alliance altogether. Abe, of course, has decided that the best way to manage Trump and manage the U.S.-Japan alliance is to flatter the American president. That's worked well for him, but it doesn't seem to have changed the fundamentals about Trump's beliefs about the value of alliances more generally. Another issue that I think I'd bring up is many of our allies in Asia have had to face the issue of American decision-making on various treaties. For example, American withdrawal from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. There were Allied consultations before that happened, or before the withdrawal was effectuated. But the sense is that, our allies were essentially informed at the very last minute. They had to sort of come on board and support the American decision politically to withdraw. But at least in Japan's case, withdrawing from INF was far from something that Japan was, I think, ready to fully understand the consequences of when everything happened. So right now, I think we just had the first report from Kyodo News just a few days ago in early November that the U.S.-Japan alliance has begun consultations on post-INF Asia issues, including potentially American missiles being deployed to Japan. But these issues, I think, also affect the alliance more broadly. So I think for Japan, I think there's a lot of serious questions here too. For South Korea, I mean, the domestic politics of alliance management, I think, are starting to look quite interesting because obviously South Korean progressives are more critical of the alliance and the value of the alliance than conservatives are generally. But now with the United States asking for what looks like an extortionary amount, $5 billion for a single year, that I think is likely to take the alliance into a direction where both sides of the political spectrum in South Korea oppose or view the alliance through more skeptical terms.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that point about domestic politics is important to keep in mind, right? So we talked about domestic politics in the United States, but the fact is that a lot of the challenges and strains that we're talking about in these alliances are happening in spite of the various things that these allies have done, right? So the fact is, in Japan, you've had Prime Minister Abe essentially preside over a Japan that is increasingly more confident, has played a very strong security role. But that has actually been a stabilizing force within the Trump administration as long as Trump is there. But if Prime Minister Abe is not in the picture in a future Japan, that is not necessarily going to be the case as much, right? So we really don't know. In a similar case, I would point out, in the case of Moon, for example, you did see some convergence of priorities between Moon and Trump with respect to diplomacy on North Korea. But as we've discussed, several times on this podcast already, the divergences are becoming increasingly clear. And if you have, Trump going back to fire and fury mode, and the United States losing patience on diplomacy with North Korea, those fissures could be there again as well, right? It's a similar case with intra-regional dynamics, right? So, you have the U.S. variable here with the Trump administration, but it's important to keep in mind, we talked about domestic politics as being one variable. Intra-regional dynamics is another one. You have Japan and South Korea now, in a spat on various issues, including, the withdrawal from GSOMIA that we talked about on the podcast. So these trends and developments are occurring alongside the uncertainty of the United States and questioning of the United States as a variable in the region. So, we should focus on what's happening under Trump's watch and what's going on with the U.S. variable. But the rest of the region isn't waiting for the United States to get its act in order. Things are happening in the region while these uncertainties are happening as well.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. But to move on a little bit, it's not just Japan and South Korea that we have to talk about on this episode. But tell us a little bit about the state of American alliances in Southeast Asia, specifically the Philippines and Thailand. The Philippines, of course, we discussed on the podcast earlier this year when Mike Pompeo delivered new assurances about the scope of the Mutual Defense Treaty, clarifying some long-held ambiguities that Manila welcomed effectively. But where have things gone since then?
I think they're pretty much in the same place, which is, with respect to both Thailand and the Philippines, what we've seen is a pattern where, we've seen an improved trajectory relative to where the Obama administration left off, ironically, because when the Obama administration left office, both Thailand and the Philippines were in a little bit of a state of flux, because Thailand, we had seen that sort of coup in 2014 that led the United States to have to restrict some forms of security assistance. And in the Philippines, we had, President Duterte come into office and question the entire notion of the alliance. And so when President Trump came into office, actually, the fact that you had President Obama gone had the opportunity for a reset on both of these alliances. And I think the Trump administration, to its credit, has done a relatively good job in terms of managing the security aspect of those alliances. So we've seen, as you mentioned, the MDT treaty clarification, which is, a historic development for the U.S.-Philippine alliance in general, right, historically. So that is a gain. And in Thailand, you've seen an improved trajectory for that relationship too. A lot of defense ties being normalized, a lot of arms sales purchases going through. But again, I do think it's important to point out, in spite of these occasional gains that the United States has made, the big strategic questions remain unresolved. So if the presumption of the Trump administration is that, the big issue is, rising the U.S. competition with China, the question remains, where are U.S. allies on this? And in both the cases of Thailand and the Philippines, you're seeing Thailand and the Philippines engage the United States on the security front, but they're also engaging China, sometimes in unprecedented ways. So both Thailand and the Philippines have actually increased security cooperation with China, not just economic collaboration, but also security collaboration. And I'm not so sure even today whether, these two countries would be, willing to be enlisted in some sort of coalition against China in any way, particularly under this administration. So you're seeing a lot of cooperation on some issues like the South China Sea and this notion of the Indo-Pacific in general. But I still think this big question about, what is the major threat and challenge that we're countering and what role these allies are playing, still a big question for both of these Southeast Asian allies.
Sure. Yeah, no, that sounds right. There's also the other issue, we've been talking about this a lot on the podcast recently, which is the difference between Trump and how Trump perceives various geopolitical issues in Asia versus his administration's strategic documents, including the Indo-Pacific Strategy, the National Security Strategy, National Defense Strategy. All of these documents identify alliances as the cornerstone of American strategy for dealing with revisionist great power competition in Asia. But of course, then when it comes to Trump, you'll have a very kind of mixed picture where the president personally is primarily obsessed with the trade war with China, obsessed with trade deficits more broadly with many of these partners, including Japan and South Korea. and by the way, one of the things we didn't actually discuss is the role of now arms sales in sustaining the health of U.S. alliances, especially in Northeast Asia. Both Japan and South Korea have now come under additional pressure to purchase American military equipment, some of which they would have done anyways, but others, it's not so clear that they would have done that. So that's been an interesting thing where Abe and Moon have now, see this as a way to effectively maintain their relationship with Trump on a personal level. So there's that, but I mean, the sort of divergence is interesting, especially at the institutional level, because we still have a lot of the good work that goes on in sustaining the U.S. Japan and U.S. Korea alliances at the institutional level. USFK, USFJ. On the Korea side, there have been modifications and cancellations of exercises, especially since the diplomacy with North Korea began in early 2018. But generally, all of that is still happening. So you are seeing the implementation of some of these, of some of this strategic guidance from the administration. But that sort of inability to reconcile what's happening at the institutional level with what's happening at the leaders level is, I think, very much a source of concern in many of these capitals. Because at the end of the day, Trump's unpredictability appears to now be increasing as a result of his political doldrums in Washington, D.C. And there's no telling, in an election year, if he decides that taking dramatic action with regard to these alliances or holding fast on cost-sharing talks, for example, might be politically astute in Washington. I don't know. What do you think about that? How is the next year of what's happening in Washington, D.C. likely to weigh on American alliances in Asia?
I think you could go one of two ways. I think one scenario is what you suggested, which is, some governments in the Asia Pacific are adopting this so-called sort of wait and see approach, right? Where they can to see, is the Trump administration going to get another term in office, or are you going to see another administration and effectively a reset in U.S. policy? But I think, in some cases of this, we've talked about South Korea and Japan as being two examples. In an environment where it's very politicized and President Trump is running for re-election, some of these issues that he cares about, whether it's free trade or burden sharing, there might actually be an increased inclination on his part to actually push for these issues, not necessarily for a foreign policy perspective, but from a domestic political perspective. And so I think the suggestion there would be that, it could actually get a lot worse before it gets better for these countries in the next year. So that's kind of the worry. I think the other thing that I would just accentuate, you already mentioned this point, but domestic politics as being a variable for these countries is really important. And so one thing to note is that, we could sort of debate, the extent to which we've seen gains under the Trump administration versus some setbacks. But I think one thing we can't argue against is the fact that across, the public opinion polls, we've seen, a decrease with respect to public perceptions of the United States in all of these alliances. There's differing degrees to that. In the Philippines, for example, U.S. popularity has always been very high. But even there, you've seen decreases with respect to what President Trump is saying, but also President Duterte. And so I think that's another component of that. We've talked about what the president is saying and the institutional dynamics of bureaucracies, but the public opinion damage, it's something that could recover perhaps under a different president or over time. But I do worry about that in the short term because, the United States is not the only country that has domestic politics. Both Japan, South Korea, all these allies have to navigate that as well. So the more that is publicly said about these things, the tougher it is for these countries to actually make concessions too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I think we'll leave it there for today, Prashant. But yeah, I think these are issues that we'll certainly be coming back to sooner rather than later. Especially, I do want to visit in more detail the cost-sharing talks with South Korea, because those are, I think, Tokyo is certainly watching that process very closely as a harbinger for what might await the U.S.-Japan alliance, especially if Trump is reelected to a second term, and the special measures agreement with Japan needs to be updated along dramatically different lines. But thanks a lot for joining me.
Good to be with you.
Great. And for listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't yet left us a note or a review on either iTunes, Google Play, or Spotify, please do so. It really helps get the word out about the show, and we really do appreciate it. Before we close out the episode, just a quick note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics Podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering this region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risk. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.